Thanks very much, Kathy. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge Ted Mack, who has very much influenced my thinking in this area, and particularly his 2013 Henry Parkes oration at Chesterfield entitled The State of the Federation, in which he looked at what the Australian Constitution was and what should be done with it. And some of this material I'm speaking about tonight has been influenced by discussions with him. And I'm really delighted to have Reimer Schmidt here tonight, who's an economist, not just one of your lefty ideologues, you know. He knows something about economics and money and those complicated things that some people here, some people everywhere, have difficulty dealing with. And he looks at the political systems and what effect that has on countries' progress in the competitive world in which we all live. So I want in my speech to introduce my own perspective. I'm a doctor by profession, and I suppose that's taught me something of the scientific method, the idea that you should get facts to deduce conclusions and that you should be limited in the sense that you know the limits of the conclusions that you can draw from the facts and data that you are dealing with or have understood. And I think that's a perspective that's very much under threat at the moment. So as I pursued my medical situation, as Kathy has said, I saw the extraordinary amount of disease caused by tobacco. I endeavoured to tell the politicians, I thought perhaps no one had told them, which of course was a ridiculous idea, but in that they'd done nothing, it was the assumption that they hadn't heard was at least plausible. So I told them and they did nothing, and so I realised that bugger up with the only group doing anything, and the question was I going to stand back and make money from all this disease, or was I actually going to try and prevent some? And so I took up my spray can. By this time I was thoroughly politicised, so of course I joined the Democrats, which were the only party that didn't take tobacco sponsorship at the time, and I went into Parliament, and then I was on the crossbench, which had the advantage that you could maintain your integrity. You didn't have to say, oh, well, I'll let the right thing go by this time because when we get government, we'll do the right thing then a bit. And I at least could believe in what I said and did. And I got some effect, but I do think the system is very much controlled by the big end of town, and the political parties, the major political parties, believe they can't do anything against the interests of the major lobby groups, and because they believe it, it naturally becomes true, and many of them don't even rattle the cage. They simply take the money and get elected again, which is very comfortable. So I want to demonstrate that our system is not only broken, but it's more broken than other comparable countries in the developed world, which is important because you can only judge these things in a relative sense. Then I want to look at whether this is a transitory problem or a systemic problem that needs major structural change. And then I want to look at alternatives. And at the moment I'm looking at the Swiss system. I'm not saying it's the only alternative, I'm just saying it is an alternative. So I thought, like any sort of proper scientific inquirer, I'd start with a few questions. So I'll give you the questions first and then work my way through the answers as we go along. So firstly, what are governments in Australia doing wrong? Secondly, why are they doing this? Thirdly, is it a problem with individuals, parties or transient situations, or is it systemic in the whole way the system is set up and works? Fourthly, what factors lead to this? Fifthly, what can be done? Sixthly, is there a better model? And seventhly, how do we get to a better situation? Now, when I thought about what governments were doing wrong, I thought, hang on, there's a tsunami here. We don't know which demonstration to go to, and we recognise each weekend that the demonstrators are being ignored and everyone's burning out. So I thought, well, I'd just try and put the things that are being done wrong into a context, into a framework, and then give a couple of examples of each. I would say that first of all, the major problems are usually put in the too hard basket. They're not even addressed, and frequently they're not even acknowledged. For example, we have a chronically bad balance of trade. We have hugely rising inequality. We don't do much about climate change. We do nothing about housing affordability, and energy policy is some sort of joke. Sometimes there are seriously wrong active policies. We go into needless wars, we privatise things, we allow fracking to destroy our environment permanently. But just in the routine, there's serious mismanagement of things that should be managed. For example, we can't collect taxes from big companies for some reason. We can't measure the gas output or collect royalties from people who take our gas from the North Sea. We can't organise the NBN. We can't even measure the water taken by irrigators. So, whoops, the pages are out of order. We can't maintain universal health insurance. We can't police the industrial relations rules so that people actually get paid according to the awards. And we make absurd demands of Centrelink recipients. Why is not clear. So I asked the second question, why are the governments doing this? I think when things are happening very badly, it can be because your paradigm has shifted, your way of looking at things has shifted over a period of time, and you don't realise that you've become limited in your thinking. And I would say there's been a blind faith in markets, reinforced by the idea that lack of access to markets led to this last two world wars, and therefore, if we have free trade, some countries will rise, some will fall, and there'll be no wars. That may be correct, and if so, that's good. That's the reason that there's been no wars. Technology has made the movement of capital instantaneous and the movement of goods very cheap. So the world has become a market, which of course favours those who are advantaged. But it's also allowed the rise of multinational corporations, who are much more powerful in relation to governments and are happy to tell governments so, and governments seem happy to believe this. But thirdly, I think there's been a change in the respect for knowledge and for long-term thinking. There's an obsession with the market, and the market only values short-term, quarterly results. It values power and it values money. Some of the things that are less valued are science, history, and languages, particularly in the political system. So the studies of those three things have declined generally, and studies of power, economics, and media have increased. As my son tells me, ignorance these days is an option. Knowledge is actually easy to get. You just look up Google on your phone and press the button. But there are increasingly people in power with no knowledge of science, history, or other cultures who don't even know what they don't know and are quite happy not to learn. This is very worrying in terms of the power that some of these people have, not to mention US presidents or even ministers in Australia. And the other point that Ted Mack made very strongly is that political parties are private entities. They're not public entities. They're private entities. They're controlled and they're funded as independent entities. So they can be bought because money gives them the access to win the elections. So if you've bought a political party, you've bought the government, and never has that been better illustrated than in New South Wales at the moment, where the Property Council and various infrastructure project people simply own the government, who do exactly what they bid. And this is the logical end point of a privatised government. And when we say we have a liberal government, what we mean is a privatised entity controls the government. Effectively, it's the alternative privatisations. And I don't think anybody realises that to quite the same extent. So is the problem with individuals or is it systemic? No, it's systemic because we can't stop corporations buying governments. We're used to everything being bought, and we can't get it in our head that this is not okay. It's even worse in Anglo systems, and when I say Anglo systems, I mean the UK, the US and Australia, because we have two-party systems where only one can win, and it's a winner-take-all. Once the winner wins, they do what they like, basically. The Senate modifies things sometimes occasionally, but generally it's a winner-take-all system. In some of the more developed parliaments in other countries, and I think Reimer may mention this, they have to get coalitions and they have to get some sort of consensus among a wider range of people. But basically, if say, a government in Australia is elected by something slightly under 40% of the vote, they then get 51% of the seats, they then get 100% of the power. So even if a faction of the 40%, which might be, say, 21%, controls the 40%, controls the 51%, controls the 100%, and effectively a huge gerrymander exists in favour of a very small number of people. Now, I would argue that the Anglo constitutions are actually fossilised. We've seen the US Second Amendment, where because they were ensured that they could carry arms to fight the Brits in their guerrilla army, now we have to have mass shootings all over the country because we can't change the constitution. In Australia, we sacked a large number of politicians because their fathers had been born in the wrong places. I mean, how ridiculous can you get? The UK, on the other hand, has no constitution, so we might ask what would happen if someone like Trump won the elections over there and said, well, I don't care about conventions, mate, I'm doing what I like. What are you going to do about it? And that would be an interesting question for the British, I think. So what can be done to undo this situation? At a philosophic level, I think we've got to get rid of some racist ideas, which is that Anglo political systems are better. This is the racist idea, really. We, the English-speaking people, are better and cleverer. We're not. We had the first democracies, but there's been a hell of a lot of improvement since then, and it's time we lifted our game. We've also arranged that they be fossilised and we can't change them. And of course, it's all very well to revere your forefathers, but your forefathers made good decisions in their time. We have to make good decisions in ours. We can't say, well, they were much cleverer than we are, so whatever was right 200 years ago is definitely right now, because of course it isn't. We have to get rid of the idea that the market can solve everything, because manifestly it can't. Now, everything is commodified. What happens to the people who haven't got money? Do they not get water? They certainly don't get housing. Where does it stop? We need to get rid of the idea that only private incentives and profits can drive anything. Good planning and people on salaries have built and done things for a great many years and would continue to do so a bit better if they were allowed. And we also have to get around the idea that the political structure which has perverse incentives can do the best for us. If you're a backbench politician with a good idea in a major party, the best thing you can do is shut up about it, because it'll stop your advancement. If it's an embarrassment to the party will stop you. And of course, if the party's been bought by a lobby group, it's completely stopped, and that idea will simply grind to a halt. So the idea that the political party's interests can actually be the public interest is unfortunately no longer current because of the power structures implicit in our system. So what has to happen is that we have to decide to take back the power. In a sense, governments have the legitimacy because they express our will. If they cease to express our will, they no longer have legitimacy. And I would argue they shouldn't be there at all. Of course, you can't take them away without a revolution, so we have to take the government back. Now, when they say, oh, the people can't decide, they won't turn up at the polls, they're unreliable, crazy things will happen. Well, if you take the marriage equality referendum, it had three lessons. Firstly, the Australian people can decide issues that politicians and political parties were incapable of doing because of the fear of lobby groups. They were basically too scared. If there's 5% will turn the election and a lobby group can raise 5%, which I don't believe the churches could, but it was possible, effectively that stymied any progress indefinitely until the people said, look, don't be ridiculous, this is where we're at. So instead of governments leading, they follow when it's convenient to the entrenched lobby groups to do so. The second thing it showed is that Australians are willing to come out and vote on significant issues, even if it's not compulsory. So the idea, oh, no one will turn up, is simply not true either. People do recognise the importance of things. And thirdly, the Australian people's view was far more progressive than the politicians. So they're not leading us, they're now following us. In fact, they haven't even got the guts to follow us. And certainly in my experience with the tobacco industry, that was absolutely the case. It was 20 years after people wanted smoke-free pubs that the government had the guts to give it to them. Now, the other lesson that came out of it was that ballots can be organised quite easily for plebiscites on issues. And it might be noted that the Swiss system has referenda every 3 months, and people turn out for those referenda, and they happen at a canton level, which is a state level, and at a federal level. So there's no reason that major decisions could not be had by referenda, as the marriage equality one was. Now, our constitution is manifestly out of date, as we saw from all the politicians having to resign because their fathers were born in the wrong place. I was fortunate that when I was in Parliament, no one asked where my father was born. He was born in North Korea, funnily enough. But of course, at that time, it was Japanese-occupied Korea, and my grandfather was a mining manager up there. But that's by the by. That didn't affect me, but, could have maybe. Although you can't have dual citizenship for North Korea, just out of the way. Now, Switzerland, instead of saying the government is in charge and the power comes down, the people have referenda. And so at the end of the day, the Parliament proposes motions to the referenda, which happen every quarter, and the people decide whether they'll approve it or not. So, in a sense, they've got things the right way around. The people make the decisions. And the structure, the hierarchical structure in Switzerland is there's the people, there's the communal assemblies, which are very, very localised. The smallest one in Switzerland is 13 people, but mostly they're bigger than that. There are cantons, which are like states, and there are 46 of those in a country of 8 million people. The largest of them is the one in Zurich, which is just under 400,000. So there's people, there's communal assemblies, then there's cantons, as I say, which are like the states here, and there's 46 of them. Then there's the United Federal Assembly, which is basically a parliament with two houses. It has the National Council, which has 200 members with proportional representation, and it has the Council of States, which has 46 members, one from each canton. So, and then the government, as called, is in fact 8 people, 7 members of the and a president. There are 8 government departments that run things, and so in the end, the government and the departments implement what is decided by the people in the referenda. So the Parliament sorts out what needs to be done, debates the issues, and formulates the motions, if you want to call it that, the propositions to go to the referenda, and the people decide. So this idea that it's some sort of anarchy, when you say the people are deciding, you have sort of visions of French revolutions with people in tricolour beanies running around smashing shops and things. But in fact, Switzerland would be, by any standards, a very, very conservative country, and it is run by plebiscites. And I am suggesting that that could be done here. So if we say, well, if you want to change the constitution in Switzerland, it can be done by a referendum, and any person can suggest a motion to change the constitution. They have to get 100,000 signatures in 18 months. If they get that, they put it to the parliaments, which may or may not agree. Whether they agree or not, it can go to a referendum. For a referendum to succeed, it needs a referendum to change the constitution needs what's called a double majority, which means a majority of voters and a majority of cantons. But to stop, if someone wants to stop a law, they only need 50,000 signatures in 100 days, and they get a single majority, which is a majority of voters, not cantons. So this is the power the individual has in that system where the people are supreme. It's not a breeze because, of course, you've got to get through the people and you've got to get the signatures. So it's not the idea that one idiot can run the show is not true, but one idiot has as much chance as an idiot prime minister, although they seem not to have those over there. So what can we do here? we have this series of dysfunctional governments. And I think we have to look at the paradigms that I've spoken about, the supremacy of the market, the idea that political parties are the only way. I think the greatest impediment to progress is the Tina principle. Whenever, there is no alternative. Tina, right? Whenever you suggest we should do this, oh yeah, but we've only got the choice of two, what else can we do? And every time you see these depressed people say, oh, it's no use voting, I'll only get the other one. No one's ever voted in Australia, they're only voted out. Most of the votes is against something, and the other one gets in by default, whether they're good or not. We have to get beyond this binary system and say, excuse me, we want serious, significant change. And then, of course, you have to say more or less what I've said tonight. This is why we need the significant change. So we want to get the idea out there that major issues must be decided by referenda. And the precedent, of course, is the marriage equality referendum and how sensibly that was managed in Australia by the Australian people. In the short term, we've got to improve the muddle that we've got. We want complete transparency in real time for all political donations, and we want limitations on those political donations. And we want a new constitution, and we want a constitution that can be changed by a double majority. And I think we've got to basically get a system where we can hand power down or up to the people who actually deserve it. Am I finished early?
Just on time.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.